actually, what struck me particularly from Richard's talk was, well, you seem to indicate that the conventional curricula are maybe not that well suited to actual people. And when I compare, for example, my own time at the university with my time at the university now when I'm teaching, I see that there's a huge difference. In my day, we were basically dropped into university and had to find our way around, and every professor could basically think about what he or she would want to teach us and the methods of it and so on. And well, it was hard at first, but we kind of managed, and we got a lot of inspiring insights as well in the process. But some also dropped out, actually, because they couldn't cope. If I look at university today, and I guess it's not much different in school, particularly with the Bologna process and things like that, there is a very, very strict control of the learning objectives, of the time schedules of the students, and so on. So would you say we have made a step back, or how would you see the balance between having a curriculum that's also controllable, but that also, on the other hand, leaves time and room for people to develop on their own, basically?
I have a real interest, coming from a background in the education mainly of young people under the age of 11. One of the critical questions I constantly ask myself is interesting. I saw on Anne's presentation, one of the key areas for development in 21st century learning is this idea of teaching children how to learn, which is kind of very big news all the time now. And I have a real problem with that perspective, because it strikes me that we are born as incredibly able learners. The minute we're born, we are learning. No one's taught us how to do it. Experts, again, will argue over the percentages, but they reckon the vast majority of everything we learn in our lifetime, virtually everything we learn in our lifetime, we learn before we're 5 years of age. If you think about the complexity of the things we take on board in those formative years. And therefore, and also when you look at early years education settings, so children under 5, and you see kids functioning in those settings, what you see are incredibly independent, self-confident, highly motivated, skilled learners who self-manage their learning. They're able to work in teams. They can manage failure to an extent. They understand when they make a mistake. They're like little toys. They bounce back up and they have another go. So they've got resilience. They've got all of those qualities. And it seems to me that the critical question, actually, is what happens to that? What does the system do to young people to take away that natural ability to be high-powered learners? And I think, in answer to your question, partly the problem is that we do change our perspective about what learning really means. From a place which is self-initiated, from a place where we're naturally born with that curiosity. And one of Ken's core arguments about creativity comes from the fact that we are all born creative, and that creativity is a fundamental part of human intelligence. So what we then do with young people, our society then says, well, what we have to do is take control of the learning process and train young people that they need to learn certain things, and we'll tell them what's important and we'll tell them how to learn it. So they then go through that system within schools, and at the other end they come into a university existence where again there is a massive requirement on self-initiated learning, on research, on development, on looking back to the past to find answers for the present and for the future, for contextualizing the purpose of learning. And actually the problem is our students have been disenfranchised through that schooling system. So they get to university and they can't cope, and that's maybe why what universities have done is altered their way of working to actually meet the way kids come out of the school system. And that actually is wrong, but what it does is sets us a massive challenge. What we have to do, I think, is find a solution to that massive point in the middle. So we've got incredibly independent, resourceful, creative learners coming out of the womb. And then we've got these people at the far end at university who are expected to be independent, resourceful researchers and learners. We've got to ask a critical question, which is actually what we have to change is the bit in the middle. Otherwise, what universities are doing is actually seeking the lowest common denominator, and they're not supporting our young people in their learning process. There's that massive black hole, and I think that's the part that we need to concentrate on.
Yeah.
Sorry, my transmitter gave out again.
Thanks. Hello, my name is Ulrich Tim from German television. I would like to question Mr. Gerver. There was in the 60s and 70s a person called A.S. Neal, and the idea was the school was Summerhill. Maybe the older people know here about that. That was at that time like a pope for education. And a lot of your ideas reminds me at this concept of schooling there. So what happened to these ideas?
I think that in the 60s and 70s, around the Western world, there were movements inspired, the Summerhill, and there are other movements in the States. There have been schools similar nature. For me, there is an interesting balance. The problem with a lot of what happened in the 60s and 70s was purely about free will and discovery. And I think within learning, and there is a confusion between the essential tools we need to educate our children to have in life to actually expand their opportunities and their freedom and their empowerment. So, for example, there are critical basic skills our children need to learn and develop. So they need to become literate in the widest sense of the word, they need to become numerate, they need to have control over a whole layer of basic academic skills. One of the problems, I think, with places like Summerhill was that their perception was that if you allow children reign of the facilities and the opportunity, they'll learn those things for themselves by choice. And I think there has to be an element of direction and understanding about how children develop. I think what's happened since those times, basically sparked maybe because of those times in education, we know so much more now about how children learn and how they develop. That what happened as a reaction to what happened in the 60s and 70s went to the other extreme, which was then a completely controlling metaphor for the way we educated our children. And I think we're still paying the price for that now. What we have to do is find the balance. What we know now, we understand far more about the process of learning. For example, when I was taught language as a student teacher, I was taught by a very old professor who was an incredibly charismatic man, and he used to sit on a stool and light his pipe and smoke. And he'd say to us, this is how we were taught to teach language, he'd say, well, teaching language is spiral learning. What you do is you expose the children to the same things and they will graduate themselves. Right? And actually, of course, that doesn't happen. What we've learnt since is there are a whole range of steps and processes. So actually, for me, there are elements of that 60s and 70s schooling which are incredibly important, the freedom, the self-determination, the choice. But what we can't do now is throw the baby out with the bathwater, if that's an expression. And so we kind of throw the bad out with the good and the good out with the bad, because that happens in education all the time. We're constantly chucking out good things and replacing them with new ideas. And what we actually have to do now, I think, is marry the processes and move away from this endless debate that it's an either-or economy. That actually the reality is what we've got to do is find the best of both worlds and create a powerful